God, in this season of the year, there's a sense of freshness with the temperature. There's also a busyness on the calendar. And so we want to pause for a few moments to collect ourselves, to focus on the moment that sits before us. At the same time, we ask for your presence to guide us and direct us in this. What we're after is reflective learning, not just knowledge for itself, but able to apply what we learn into our own lives, and so that it does a couple things. It leads to greater transformation. It leads for greater effectiveness in our walk with you. It leads into some form or fashion evangelism, even if it's just in the form of being basic salt or light to the world around us. So there's a host of things that we hope to accomplish this morning. At the same time, we acknowledge that the 3 to 5 burdens, concerns that we've listed just in general conversation, that would not even be the tip of the iceberg of the burdens that are collectively represented here inside of this room. And some of those that we carry with the sense of joy. We're happy to carry those. They're things that are pressing on our life that are good, and yet at the same time there are things that are pressing upon our life that are so painful and so difficult to manage, that what we are is drawn to a sense of prayer, really, because that's might be the only thing that we can do. And we trust in you, and we trust in this time that you will either work inside of us so that we would be a vessel of your grace and mercy, or that you would inhabit our prayers, and then that would then do something that affects you in such a way that there's direct involvement, not with people or humanity, but a direct involvement with your Holy Spirit. Either way, God, what we hope is for remedy, and what we hope is for wholeness in our life, in the burdens and the concerns that we carry, and in the world in general. We're mindful of our neighbors to the north of us that have experienced great tragedy in the form of weather, and then for just a host of things that are around the world that we're sensitive to. Again, we want to lift them up as well. In this moment, and these moments to come, we give ourselves to you for the purpose of learning. This we pray in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, so we're in. Hey, Sandy.
Hi.
Oop. Oh, come on in. Hey. Hey, Faith. How you doing? So we got some cookies and some cakes. All right. We're in Exodus 20. Right at the very end of Exodus 20, and then we're looking at the second half of this fourth ascent that ends in 24:11. And what we're doing is the 10 Commandments fall inside. I mean, we could really start with 20 and go to 24:11. That's the complete thought of this fourth ascent where Moses goes up. But it's obviously dominated, this fourth ascent is dominated by the giving of the 10 Commandments. And in the weeks to come, we're going to look at the fifth ascent, which is a very long piece from 24 to 32. It has to do with worship. That can be divided into a couple of different sections. You've got items that deal with physical things that are used in worship, like utensils and altars and things like that. But then you also have a large piece that's devoted to the priest, and there's some certain things that we can draw that. The sixth ascent has to do with intercession. This is where there's the golden calf incident, and Moses intercedes on behalf of the people, and then you have a form of restoration on the last one. And so we're about, even though it's a lot, if you look at chapter 24 through 40, there's a lot of chapters, so there's a lot of information, but it falls around some very clear, distinctive themes. So just a few more weeks in the book, and we'll basically be finished. But today's task is to look at the second half of this fourth ascent, Exodus 20, 22 through 24 through 11. Now, I trust that as good students that y'all were in high school and college and now here at this time, that you were very faithful in reading the text multiple times, perhaps even reading it out loud to see any breaks, or maybe getting different versions of the Bible and reading and comparing them to each other, right? That's exactly what we did. Thank you. Yes, perfect. All right. So we don't need to necessarily. We are going to read through the text and look at it, but I want to start with a question. Now, keep in mind the larger scope. What's going on? People have left Egypt. They're on their way to Promised Land. There's this stop at Sinai. We've argued in the past that this was on purpose. That this was not just a bathroom stop to grab something to eat and then on our way up. This was actually something that was designed in the very beginning. And so we talked a great deal about what was their expectation here, and one of the things I want to ask is that because Sinai was on purpose, for lack of better words, and what we find in Sinai is people receiving a way of life as a further explanation and development of the covenant that they were already in with God. Is the Ten Commandments enough for a group or a society or for a people to live in a theocracy, which is what this is, a God-dominated or a God-ruling style of life? Do they need anything else? Yes. They do. Why? That's the correct answer. So good on you. You got a star. Why?
I had a friend one time I was trying to talk to him about God, and he said, "Well, I thought I lived by the Ten Commandments," and I thought, well, now that's not enough.
Okay. Well, the ten. All right, go ahead.
Jesus, but that's one of the reasons I think Jesus came.
Well, all right. Let me ask you this. Let's use that same analogy, and we'll jump forward into the New Testament. Are the Gospels enough for Christians to live by?
No. Yes.
All right, well, I would agree with you. All right, so why?
We don't do your heart rate, because your heart has to be changed.
Okay, all right, well, we're assuming heart changed. I'm talking about for practical living. Let's assume that they fully embrace and agree with 10 Commandments. They leave the mountain. They're getting ready at some point in the future to go into Promised Land, make the same jump with Christians in the New Testament. Jesus' sacrificial death, resurrection, proof of God's overcoming sin, belief. People will take John 3 at its word. They believe, born again. What next? That's really what we're after.
I think it's some of the questions that we talked about, or some of the things we talked about when we were looking at the commandments themselves, that it needs to be more specific for everyday living.
Right.
It's like the laws, Congress or the legislature makes a law, but it has to be translated into regulations for use.
Okay.
It's sort of the same idea.
Right, and I would agree with that. I think that's why there are more information in the New Testament other than just the Gospels. It's not to say that they usurp the Gospels, but they help further explain the Gospels. There's more laws. In what you read from last week to this week, this is, now you can see the general themes of the 10 Commandments that show up here, but it gets fairly specific. And so the question I'm asking is, why? Well, and the answer, according I mean, I would agree with it. I think it's a good answer, is the Ten Commandments might be the larger scope of law, but so do we say to these people from receiving the Ten Commandments going forward is, commandment number 1 is this, commandment number 2 is this, but don't murder, premeditative, intentional. But what happens if there's when there's dispute on whether or not it was intentional? Do we just say, the law is this, and we just let people go, or what? So I would argue that what we have before us today is to help explain and to give insight into the day-to-day complexities of living, of just living in general, of how that plays out amongst a group of people. Does that make sense? And so that it's not to take away from the Ten Commandments, but it's to help further explain the Ten Commandments. And so that's why inside this fourth ascent, you have just 20 verses, 21 verses that describe the Ten Commandments. Then you got a little bit about an altar, and then you get into just 4 or 5 different subjects that have to deal with, how do you take honor thy mother and father? What does that look like? All right, well, that probably might look different for the child's perspective than it does for the parents, right? It might look different from the mother's perspective than it does for the father. And so there's a further description of how all that plays out. Now, what we haven't done a lot of, and mainly just so that we don't get bogged down in it, is we could take different portions of the book of Leviticus and we could take different portions of the book of Deuteronomy, and we could lay them out and see some of the same teachings of how they show up, and even though they were written at different times. Now, collectively, what that would do is that would give us a further description of what the Ten Commandments are like in daily living, because some of it is developed out of case law. Example, well, what constitutes an idol? Do you know? I mean, the text just says don't make an idol, all right? And then it says don't bow down to it. Well, what's an idol? Okay, but be more specific. Is that has to be physical, like this cup, or can it be something that is metaphysical? Lust. All right. How do you define lust? Is that just sexual? All right. So there's some things that that there's a good reason why there is description here. It's to help the people, because, and I'll fast forward to the end, the idea is in all of this, in this fourth ascent, is that all life for these people are to be seen through the lenses of something spiritual and religious as dictated by God. And their response to that is to be a distinctive people by being obedient. And so we got to flesh that out. What does it mean to worship the Lord your God? Well, I don't know how many people we got here. 40 or so? I bet we got 40 different answers. Is it 11 o'clock? Is it 9 o'clock? Is it 8:30? Is it on the beach? Is it 6:30 contemplative service? Is it, they give you insight to that. And that's what we have going through the rest of the book, is to take aspects of the Ten Commandments and elaborate on them so the people, what they're getting is directions for what it would be like to go in and live distinctively in this promised land. And a lot of this is getting fleshed out before they get there. Well, then they get there, and guess what? Got to have to be fleshed out even more, which gives us insight into the judges, and it also gives us insight into the prophets. And so, I mean, this is, see all of this in a continual movement of God with the people for distinctive living, which is directly influenced by their relationship with God. So, I would argue, and I think that I'm assessing the crowd that at least there's some level of agreement that this is not filler just to kind of get us to the next ascent, that this is actually on purpose for a certain reason. And what we find is that it's an elaboration or further explaining of the Ten Commandments. And that's good. And that's helpful for the people. Just as the epistles and all the other writings in the New Testament are helpful for the Gospels. It's stuff that we need because what are the epistles in the New Testament? Who writes the epistles? Who are they? Paul writes some, Peter writes some of them are disciples, apostles, things of that nature. Who are they writing to? Believers, more specifically believers in certain areas. That would be a church, all right, in a city or a church. And they are addressing certain topics, which means that in living with the Gospels and then applying that, changed heart, born again, applying that to daily life can get fuzzy. Correct? Which is why you have people weighing in who would be leaders, heavyweights, things of that nature, to help the people work through what they believe and how they apply that into daily living. And so it's good, and it's on purpose. It's for living a distinctive way in obedience as a direct relation to being connected to God. All right? So another question I've asked too is that is there, when you read this, tell me your, what was your general thoughts behind this? First reactions, or did it feel restricting? Did you see any grace? If so, what?
Well, that 21:2 is if you buy a Hebrew slave, he'll serve 6 years, and the 7th year he'll be
Right.
free. That would be a form of grace.
Sure. So right. So when we get into servants or slaves, we'll see that requires a specific way of life that is not similar or that is not the same as the surrounding cultures. And what we're going to discover is that there's limits to it, and that's distinctive of here, more so than distinctives of, say, some of the other cultures in the surrounding area. What about even before we get to slaves or to servants? What about in this from 22, this is chapter 20, 22 through 26. What do we find God telling Moses? Making an altar, right? They're going to make it a certain way, right? And
Wherever I cause my name to be honored,
okay,
I will come to you and bless you.
bingo. All right, what is the idea of, go back to the concept of blessing that we looked at. No one likes to show off though, Betty. That's 2 answers in a row, I'm just telling you. So, yeah, exactly right. So, but what you have is this concept of blessing where God is the one who's doing it. God is the dictator of it. God is the subject behind that. The people are the object. They are the ones who receive that. Well, blessing itself is anchored in the whole concept of grace. And so even in what we would probably say just that first reading is just nothing but law, what we discover is that the whole backbone behind this is a God who wants to be with them, a God who wants to bless them, which is centered on God's gracious love and care. And so it's what's woven into this. Remember, this is not new. One of the things that we looked at very early on that we find with the whole a covenant God who wants to be in covenant with people is that God's graciousness always precedes God's giving of the law. And you see it even here. I mean, it's a reminder back even on the very beginning when we talk about, I mean, or the very beginning of this passage for today, is that even in the formation of an altar, the altar itself built a certain way, which is distinctive, but it's for the purpose of God coming to be with the people, which is a form of blessing. And when we look at the very last part of this, what we have is covenant promised, covenant confirmed. But what is the indication? Look, fast forward a little bit to 23. 23:20. Right. And so again, a form of grace that they're not just wandering aimlessly and it's all on them to be obedient to the law. You even have, the reminder of the promise again, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to direct you. You're actually going to have somebody to lead you. And then, of course, the latter part of that is they again confirm that. So we see even in this passage where at first reading it sounds like just law, that what's woven into all of this is God's grace, which is pretty fantastic. There's two reassurances that God gives. I mean, one is an angel would prepare the way for them, but at the same time that you have the beginnings of a sacrificial system, which means what? If you make a mistake, that's exactly right. If you make a mistake, there's a way to be forgiven. So let's get into some of these. Becky's already picked up on some of this about the actual different segments in here where you have this idea about laws concerning slaves and servants. Now we did have at least where there's some certain rules set up behind that, which is also an act of grace, and that is that servants are not forever. That there's limits to it, ma'am. Servants or slaves, they're not slaves forever. If you look at 21:2, when you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years. Actually, that word slave is not the best word. The word should be servant. When you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th year he shall go free. It's probably not the best return on your investment, is it? I mean, I guess you could, yeah, exactly right. So, yeah, I guess that's all depend on what you buy it for and how much you pay, I guess. So,
You get his wife and his children.
right.
I assume there were separate rules for other foreign slaves.
There were, but now the question's a great question that's asked. One of the questions that is asked is, were there a separate set of rules for non-Hebrew servants? And there was. We don't get that here. We get it later on. But what we do later on in another book, not Exodus, but what we do get as a governing principle is this refrain that shows up in verses 23. And after the break, we're going to talk more about this. 23, where you'll find it's in this portion 23:1 through 13. Hang on, let me find it in just a second. But the concept is, however you treat people, you have to be mindful that you were once slaves as well. 9, thank you. You shall not oppress the sojourner. That would be the non-Hebrew. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. It won't use that same terminology, but what shows up, I hope you saw this when you read this, a couple of different times is don't forget, hey, you were once one of these. And so that becomes a governing factor all throughout the Torah. The first 5 books of the Old Testament is that you were once a slave. So how you treat people who are not your own, you have to be mindful of that.
What sort of timeline is this? I mean, are they in the wilderness 40 days?
Well, the question is how long are they before they enter into the Promised Land? The years that are mentioned are 40. Now that brings up a larger question of, is it literal 40 years or not? And the answer is we don't fully know, because there are times where Moses spent 40 years on the mountain, or at least in personal wilderness. The biblical number for 40, like the biblical number for 7, like the biblical number for 3, there are times where it's literal, and then there are times where it's not. And so, you have to hold into consideration the context of the information to try to figure out if it's more literal or is it a theological number that's being used to express wholeness or a completion of time. I would argue that in the use of 40 in the book of Exodus, it's more theological than the actual 40 years, of 40 365-day years, that what's required is a period of time for Moses. Remember, when Moses leaves Egypt, he leaves with his tail tucked between his legs, and he is defeated. And so there's a level of hitting rock bottom for a period of time, brokenness, so that the next time we find him, where is he? He's about to go into God's presence in Exodus chapter 3 for what? For restoration, for a purpose to go and be a leader. Now, whether or not that's 40 years, literal years, I'm okay with that. I mean, it's however long it took Moses to get to that. And, 40 years is a pretty long time. Now, whether or not they were 40 literal years of wandering from down here, and they come in, they don't just kind of go up this way. This is where the Philistines are, and they're pretty formidable. They actually kind of meander around in here, and eventually they go into the Promised Land this way through through the side door, for lack of better words. And there's a time of, we don't get it in Exodus, but we definitely pick it up in Deuteronomy, is that there's a period of where they're struggling to own all these rules and live into that and things of that nature. So it might have been 40 literal years, or it might have been a period of time for a generation to know, to live, to experience, and then for some to pass away. So I mean, I think you could argue both ways and it'd be okay. The text just gives the 40 years and then moves on. So it's not necessarily concerned with the question of time the way we are concerned with the question of time. And the Hebrew understanding of time is really twofold. One is chronos, where we get chronological time, 1, 2, 3 on down the line, and that would be more of the literal sense. But there's a kairos type understanding of time, which is the high points and or the most important points. For instance, if who's been married more than 40 years in here? All right, we got a number of hands. All right, 50 years. Got any more than 50? More than 50? 60? It's like an auctioneer. All right, so we got 50, 55, 50. All right, so we got 55, a couple of those. If I asked you to describe your marriage, you could sit down and say, okay, year 1, this, year 2, this, year 3, you probably could, or you could talk about, we got married at this time, maybe we were living here at this time, we had children, first child or only child or whatever at this time, and then later on, we experienced this, and then, then grandchildren. That's probably how you would describe your life over 50 plus years. And so what you've done is you've not talked about it in terms of chronological message as much as you've described the kairos message. This is who I am, this is what I'm about, and this is what it means for us in our marriage. So Hebrews use this all the time. Like for instance, in Genesis 1, in the beginning, that is a kairos time element, not a chronos time element. When the Gospels are written, the same thing. Probably a good translation, and you might find this sometimes in the paraphrase, where it'll say, in the beginning, it'll translate that at the appropriate time when God saw fit to do this. This is what He did, and so it's kairos more so than chronos. So, but great question. I mean,
I just wondered because they had to fight all these people.
right. Now, we do know that once they get into the Promised Land, the conquest took about 300 years. Yeah, that's about to get to form the boundary. It took hundreds of years. It wasn't something that was done overnight. Now, what we have is the record of Jericho, because that's the first big, threshold that they cross. And you've got a lot, during the Joshua period of time, and even into Judges, you're still trying to form the boundary. And so the boundary's not fully formed really until probably David. Well, I mean, I'm talking about it was formed for a period of time, and then it was lost, and then formed again, and then lost again. But the formation of the boundary is set with David, and under his rule as king, and of course he moves the capital to Jerusalem, sets it up there, and the rest is somewhat history. But what we have is we see some grace in the middle of this, which is I think gives you insight into God, that even when God's holiness is described, it is described as a holy love, where both of those are held together in contention, and the purpose is to inform the people as they move in to this promised land, to be this a distinctive way of life, which shows up in obedience to God's word, as described here. Not word as in the Bible, but the audible word to God via Moses. And so it needs to be elaborated on. And we find it first when it comes to slaves or servants. Now, what's interesting here is that obviously there's a time limit that's already been picked out, and we do have some indications about marriage. That's fairly that coincides with other cultures as well. That if someone is a servant and if the owner gives a wife the wife's not freed. If they have children, that still is the ownership of the owner. But what's interesting here, that's a little bit different than compared to some of the surrounding cultures, is what happens when somebody doesn't want to be set free on year 7. Well, what do you do? Do you just kick them out and say, have at it? I mean, what does the text say? What's that? Right. Well, all right, that's significant. Okay, what's the significance of piercing the ear? Visual sign. Bigger than that. It is a visual sign for sure. In part of the way the Hebrews saw the body, certain organs were the seat of certain things. Like when you read in the Old Testament, you have a reference often to the bowels or the gut as the seat of emotions or the seat of being. That shows up early on, particularly in the book of Genesis. When you get into later on into the Old Testament, it moves from bowel area, gut area, colon area to heart. All right, and then heart is picked up heavily in the New Testament, the ear was the organ for obedience. And you see, the Latin, if you study Latin, you can see that in the way the language shows up. Absurdity, you know what? The root there is someone who doesn't listen. All right, and the idea is by piercing the ear, the importance is that you're piercing the organ that is responsible for obedience. And see the word picture here too. God is speaking via Moses. They hear and obey. So you can see the connection between hearing and obeying. And the ear was the sign of that. And so to pierce the ear is to adopt a perpetual state of obedience for that person to the owner or to the master. Now, I'm not sure that shows up with piercing an ear today. I don't know. I don't know if that is that. Maybe that could be the origin of earrings. So who knows? But so you do have a couple of things that show up that's important for us. One of them is that the concept of servanthood or slavery, even though that's not a word that shows up, it doesn't translate well in the Hebrew, is the idea that it's not for life. There's limits to it, and that's distinctive. And then you've also got some insight and some protection for care for those who serve, and that if there are people who want to stay in this form of lifestyle, one, it has to be the person initiates it. For instance, like when you show in verse 5, but if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, my children, and I will not go free, then the master shall bring him to God. He shall bring him to the door or the doorpost. His master shall bore the ear or pierce the ear, and then the person would be a slave forever. The idea first is freedom. But if one chooses not to do that, then there are parameters and care for those persons who choose not to do that. And the owner was required to do certain things as well for that. So we got some distinctive things. You've got the whole concept of limits. You got the whole concept of ear, at least when it comes to obedience, and what's responsible on the servant side and what's responsible on the owner side. What else shows up in the whole servants? Anything else that pops out for you as a distinctive way of life? Are there limits to what an owner can do or what a person can do to someone who is a slave? Or to people in general? What about the protection of female slaves? Beginning in verse 7 through 11.
It's really confusing.
Okay, tell me what's confusing about it for you. That means
It took me a long time to realize that he was where it says if he selects her for his son, he must grant her a rights of daughter. For some reason, I didn't click together that was the master's son that he was selecting.
right. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I got you there. Yeah, that's if in the transaction from dad to owner, if the owner purchases the daughter, the dad's daughter, not the owner's daughter, but for the owner's son, then the woman or the girl, whatever it may be, she has rights. All right, that's fairly. I know it, but I mean it's still rights compared to in a time that did not have rights at all. And so, I mean, you can see a little bit of the distinctiveness that shows up here when you compare that to other cultures of this time period. There were not rights. I mean, it's property, just property in general, and very low on the totem pole. And so, at least you have some parameters of for the person, and even care for that person, care for females. That's very progressive, considering the time, and some of that is, I would argue, distinctive in nature, because they are to represent. They are to be a representation of what it's like to live with this God. And so when you live a certain way, whether it be physically or whether it be in a socially or inside of the family, or however you want to define that out, if that's distinctive compared to the surrounding cultures, well, the answer is why? Well, it's because they belong to this God, and this is what God requires of them. You know, I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, it's you know, I'd have to go back and look at the origin. My history lesson of indentured servitude shows up in the American colonies and the Magna Carta, which is obviously a long ways from here. But and the Magna Carta, of course, predates the formation of the 13 colonies. But in my first year history of college, I can think back to, actually can see the test that says what was the style of, you know, indentured servitude. So I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's a great question to.
The New Testament even says
Yeah,
that you should be bond servants.
Yeah, there's obviously slavery is very, very prominent inside the cultures, not just in this area here.
Indentured servants are very prominent in
Right.
early American history.
No, they are, and so you know, I don't know. Just that could be the case. Now we have a huge time difference between now and then, and so you know, there could be a strand that starts to roll, you know, that starts to run through all this, and it could be that whole concept. But both of them are limited forms of servanthood. That's the larger picture. If you lay them out, both of them have limits to it, compared to just straight out, you know, total slavery, property, no rights, mine forever, can do whatever I want. I mean, you've got limits here. And so the question that you might ask is, why are there limits here compared to other areas of that time period that don't have limits? Well, one of the conclusions that I think is an accurate conclusion is because they are to live distinctively. But those are great questions to ask.
I wanted to ask about, because it says, and I understand what they're saying, but I don't understand the reasoning, but it says, if a man sells his daughters or servants, she's not to go free as men servants do, right? So that at the end of the 7 years, 6 years, whatever she is, she's still
Right.
a servant. Now, is that because it was worse off for a woman to be on her own, or is it, or do you know?
I do not. I mean, that is a possibility, because there were not rights on the same way that, you know, they couldn't own property yet. They could not. Their livelihood was tied to whatever a form, a male, whether it be dad, whether it be owner, whether it be husband, and so we don't know. This is just one of those that we just don't have all the information there. I think that's a plausible answer. You know, but I mean, again, we don't know. And
she is allowed to go.
right, so I mean, you know, the takeaway is obviously some of this in the original hearing and the adopting of this. I mean, there are things they would have known that we just don't know because we're separated by history. What we do know, we can, as in context, we can apply to the text and at least see some of the larger pictures that are fairly clear, like limits, like certain rights, and there's certain rights considering certain parameters. You know, if married, if not married, if taken as a daughter, if not taken as a daughter, times where they can go free, times when they cannot. Now, we're not going to know the ins and outs to all of that, but at least we can draw some conclusions that are fairly safe like the bigger pictures of limits and certain rights. And then when we compare that to other cultures, we definitely can see that this is even further progressive than, say, some of the other cultures.
I'm just curious, do we have any information as to how long they practiced this and did it like 5 days?
Well, when we get into Kings, the short answer to that is that some of the rules don't apply when it comes to the kings. And because when you look at the kings, there are good kings and there are bad kings. And, obviously Israel gets in trouble because they want to have a king like the other nations. Well, those were absolute rules. And so, or absolute authority, things of that nature. That I think you could make a case inside the larger understanding of the Old Testament that that's not exactly how God saw the king. And but you just have Israel moving down, or the children of Israel moving down a slope that actually gets them in trouble. And later on, I mean, they are captive. The prophets equate that to one of the reasons of their captivity. But we don't know. When you get into, we don't have all the evidence of the day-to-day living other than this. We can look into the Judges, and we can look into some of the historical parts of the Old Testament, like your Samuels, your Kings, and Chronicles. They give you some insight into some day-to-day living, but it's not like pull up October what's the day, the 6th? Pull up October the 6th. We don't we might not know what that was like. But obviously I would argue that this was adopted at least during the conquest. I think you can make a pretty good case of that. After once the borders are settled, they live off a king type understanding, and I mean it just is all over the place. You've got Solomon, for instance. I mean the guy's got how many wives and how many concubines? I mean just the thought of that in my mind just I mean I think the Chinese word for anxiety. I think it is. Seriously, I mean, someone can Google it up. I think it's the Chinese word for strife or anxiety is 2 women, 1 home. That's the word picture. It's formed from a couple of different words, and I would say that's not a knock towards women. What I'm saying is this: living together just 1-to-1 can be hard enough. I mean, I can't imagine if it's living together 1 to 700, 1 to however many wives, or I just. And maybe they're more advanced than me. I can handle 1 wife, 2 kids. That's good for me. And after that, sometimes I can't even handle that. So, but there's a Chinese word that the word picture is, it's multiple people, and it's multiple spouses in one house. I mean, so it's that would be. There's a reason why Solomon is an apostate when he leaves office. I mean, and it's not women-based. He just screws up. I mean, massively. So, all right. Any other comments or questions about slavery in general? All right, move a little bit. We're going for about 5 minutes. I want to move into the next little section, and that has to deal with laws. I think your Bible might say laws around restitution or laws around violence. And it shows up in 21:33, and it runs for till 21:33, and it runs to 22:15. And why do they spend a lot of time, or why do they feel like, or that's the wrong word. Why is there a further explanation or description of laws that have to deal with restitution or with just violent behaviors?
They lived in a violent society.
Because they were violent. That's exactly right. I mean, and because they needed them. And but again, inside of this, are there areas of grace? What would they be? Shelter cities of refuge, absolutely. Notice also there's in verse 20 through to 25. What shows up in verses 22 through 22, 25?
Explanation of the eye for an eye. That
Right.
thought that we talked about.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this last week. Which is what? Is it an excuse or justification, or is it a limit?
It's a limit.
Right, it's a limit.
Another thing I was seeing too is that in a time when it was the biggest and the strongest,
Mhm.
this gives value to
Right.
all people.
Well, bingo. And go back to the slaves, okay? Go back to the servants. You've got limit. Limits is a valuing term. Now, that's my term, but I like the word you use, Becky, where you say this is value statements or value laws or rules. That's probably a better word than limits. What it's not is just absolute dominance. And so even with these cities of refuge and into an exact determination of what the limit is. For instance, if if there's a level of mistreatment in some form or fashion, and it ends up being in the form of miscarriage, if it ends up being in the form of loss of arm or limb or eye or whatever it may be, there's limits to what the prescribed punishment or retaliation will be. Well, I mean that's a grace-filled act.
When, during this time, like with these laws that we could strike a person and all this stuff, was there some kind of judicial system that would punish the people that did the wrong thing?
Yeah, they remember it now. Back in they have it's Exodus 18, where you have Moses takes care of the Moses will do the capital murder Supreme Court stuff. Then you have a list of all the tribal heads, or they're broken down into areas. That's what Jethro helps him to establish, is that Moses can't be the judge for all of them. So what you have is, to use our language, you have the beginnings of a judge/court system, and they would be dependent upon seriousness of case. One of the things that comes out of Exodus chapter 18 is, Jethro saying, Moses, you're going to kill yourself if you try to do all this. Set you up some trusted people who can be judges, and you take care of the big stuff. You let them deal with the little stuff. And so they do have a. What's that?
So that must have been last week when I was not here.
Oh no, we did this a long time ago. This was Exodus 18. That could have been 2 years ago for about the speed. But what's interesting though is that you do have limits again, and the limits revolve around a value of life, and keep in mind, think back to this refrain that shows up. I'm going to paraphrase it. How you treat sojourners and people in your land, you need to be mindful of what it was like when you were the one being oppressed. You can't get away from that. And so you can see grace in the middle of a section of a book that we normally attribute to law. And it doesn't mean that the laws aren't important, or they're not good, or they're not for a purpose, but in the middle of all this is grace. All right, let's take a break. I know it's pretty close to break time, and we'll take a break for about 10 or 12 minutes. Okay, let's go ahead and come back together. All right. A couple of things I do want to make mention real quick about the cake. Cake didn't do it. I was trying to think of cake and maybe somebody would pay attention, but didn't work. All right. You caught that? One or two? So in the whole cities of refuge, notice what the text also says, that even if someone is at the altar, I mean, what the scripture, what Exodus says is that even if someone is at my altar, but they're guilty, they are to be taken from my altar. Now, there's a little bit of code into that. In pagan cultures, the altar was considered the safe place, but that's not here. What's the safe place is the city. And so if we, by looking at some of the surrounding areas, we could see that here again, this is something that's distinctive to the children of Israel, because in the pagan cultures, it would be an altar is considered the place of safety, but not somewhere here. All right, so now we get into this this part of this portion of Scripture that deals with social life. Your text or your Bibles might have this in a setting that says social justice or communal life, things of that nature. What stood out in your reading there? We're in chapter 22, verses 16. And the reason why we're moving there is because the subject matter is going to change from laws or rules that have to do with either violence or restitution, now to laws that have to deal with either a communal way of life or social justice. I'm not sure how your Bibles will list that, but the subject matter of the laws have changed, and so it's a change in thought for us. And so we have beginning in 22:16 through 23:9, they will have to deal with life together as a whole. And some of the things that come out, what are some of the things that stand out to you that are at least noticeable from your reading? Say more to that. What? Now, I saw that Maple Ridge is for sale. So is that the headlines you were talking about? Okay, which ones are you talking about then? Oh, the Vice. Okay, yeah, all right. So, well, yeah, you get into some of that. So, now, obviously, the very beginning talks in some level sexual relationships show up in this side or a portion. And you've got probably something that would be it says if a man seduces a virgin, but you can read into some of that. You've got right. That's that refrain that shows up repeatedly. We've already looked at two. This would be the third one that we've noticed. Is that be careful of those who are sojourners or aliens. Non-Hebrew would be the right. How you treat them is important, because you need to remember that at one point you were the one that was the alien. Of course, now this one gives us a further description of some of the other one, because it talks about orphans and hearing the cry, and you've got some pretty strong words that show up in 24 about God's, what we haven't seen is that my wrath will burn and I will kill with the sword, So those are pretty, but the idea is that if you mistreat people who don't have the ability to care for themselves, that's the crucial issue here, because these would be people that are without standing inside of the children of Israel. But also notice, what we do find in here is obviously the care of others, which is what Susan just picked out. You also got issues around certain sexual type activities, and I think that might be what, maybe not specifically what Gene was talking about, but definitely the headlines and the vices that show up. Notice that there's a great deal in this section that has to deal with religious practices. Why would that be needed? I mean, if you got Commandment 1 and 2, I mean, why would you have to put extra rules about religion? I mean, no other gods before me, that's pretty clear, right? And then it talks about don't make any idols, particularly idols that you're going to bow down to. Why would you think that Moses needs, and Moses, or God via Moses, speaking through Moses, has to give a fair amount of explanation about that?
They come from a culture that was full of idols.
Right, all right. They're coming from a culture that was full of idols. They're going into a culture that is full of idols. And part of, too, is have we ever talked about the difference between Judeo-Christian worldview and pagan worldview when it comes to how they perceive reality? Did we ever talk about that? All right. This gives you some insight into this. What's that? Okay, well, basically there are two types of worldviews that show up via Scripture. One of them would be, to use Old Testament language, a pagan worldview. The other one would be obviously a Judeo-Christian worldview, or Old Testament, New Testament. And the idea in the pagan world is that if this is reality, that you have deity or God and you have humanity or creation, and they're not separate. They're all linked together. And so in order to get deity to move on your behalf, or to get a desired end, humanity must learn the code that is hidden in creation. Magic. Right? How do you, if I have a wand and I want to zap Ann, what do? I got to come up with the magic words, and pow, she gets it. All right? And so the idea is, sorry, Ann, you're sitting in seat 1, So the idea is, if I can figure out the right incantation, or if I could figure out the right sacrifice, if I can figure out the right way of tapping into the deity world, then I can dictate deity to do what I want, because it's all connected. And there are these hidden rules and levers that can be pulled, and if I pull them, God has to act this way. Compare that to the Judeo-Christian worldview, which is God is completely separate from creation or humanity. And God reveals Himself to creation, but they are distinct. They are not the same. And so God, as in here, they're all linked together. And so the reason why you would have laws that have to deal with idols, or even when in verse verse 18, should not permit a sorceress to live, or you might have another translation other than sorceress. What? Okay. Or the other one says, don't sacrifice to any other god, things along those lines. The idea is because this is a completely distinctive difference compared to the pagan understanding. And so there will not be human sacrifices like they're over here, because that's trying to find the right lever to pull so you can get the deity to do whatever you want, to find the right incantation. Here, God is completely other, completely separate. The reason why creation or humanity knows God is because God has revealed to humanity what God wants humanity to know. Does that make sense? This is a completely different understanding, or completely different worldview. So when we fast forward into the New Testament, you have the same type of things that show up in the epistles that show up here. Well, the reason why is because of this. It's completely different, looking at creation, looking at the world, and how God interacts with the world around. Any comments or questions, concerns? This is really important to understand a biblical worldview of how God and creation are together.
And what a change it was at that time.
Right. Yeah. This would be, and it's still. If you look at world religions today, I mean, there's only three. You could put Islam into this camp to some degree, because monotheistic, God completely other than creation. All the other worldviews in some form, world religions in some form or fashion show up as derivatives of this. So it's really important to see the larger lens or the larger view of what's going on with how world or creation and creator are linked together. So that'll give you insight into why there's not sorcery is permitted, why offering, sacrifices to other gods that's a big deal to God. And because it strikes at the heart of how God has revealed himself to creation. And then what's required of a distinctive way of life by the people who are connected to God. They are to look and to act differently. The way some of this, the bestiality, that was practiced in pagan cultures. So you have that's a no-no here. A lot of the religious, how you care for others. I mean, we could put that back on the board. And, care for others. The aliens also lending, things of that nature. Notice also, don't curse the ruler. Whoops. There's a lot of things that show on here. What's that?
We shall not, guys, we will not permit a female sorcerer to live.
I don't know. I mean, because there are other parts in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, that just say sorcery in general. And what does yours say? Sorcery. Sorcery. Yeah. So right. I mean, it doesn't show up in Exodus. There are other parts in the Old Testament that talk about sorcery in general. Particularly when you get into the Judges and into the historical parts where you have priests who are tied to different deities, some female deities, some male deities, and how that gets played out in practice. I don't know why it's just feminine listed here and not masculine, because if you look at the Old Testament as a whole, you can find examples where masculine is used as well.
Shane, with your understanding of the Ten Commandments in this time, if the Ten Commandments were what were written on the tablet of stone, the rest of these chapters and
Right.
other places too would have been just what God told Moses, and then he repeated to the people.
Right, that's correct.
And that's how it was passed down for.
Right. Now, there is, we don't have record of like original Exodus. We have early versions of the Torah, the first 5 books, but we don't have, but we also don't have the 10 Commandments. And so, what we're taking at what it says at face value, that 10 Commandments were written down on tablets, but that Moses is giving instruction to what he also heard on the mountain. It does get codified and written later on, but that's even after Moses. I mean,
So it would have been word.
right, sure. Oral tradition shows up even in the New Testament. Oral tradition, the earliest Old Testament book are the Thessalonians, and they're in their early 50s. And so, the earliest gospel is Mark. And so, the last gospel is John, and that's not till the turn of the 1st century. So, you have an oral tradition that shows up in both Old Testament and New Testament, and then eventually gets written down and codified later on, and then vetted through different councils of the leaders of the church or the leaders of the faith. And that's how we get to what we have now, both Old and New Testament. But there is oral tradition that shows up here that both in Old Testament and New Testament. But it does talk about in the text, 10 Commandments being written. This is now God, God speaking to Moses, and the Lord said to Moses, Moses, you go tell the people that. But we don't have it. I mean, I'd have to go back and look the earliest version of Exodus that we have. It'll show up inside the larger scope of the Torah, the first 5 books. There won't be a standalone Exodus. Does that make sense? Good question. All right. Any other comments about what we would call the social life or the communal life? But what you have, you have stuff that dates back or that deals with Judeo worldview, or at least worldview here. It'll also be worldview of Christianity when we get to the New Testament. So you have laws and rules that deal with that, and you have laws and rules that deal with paying attention to the people who are around you. You do have to care for them as well, and that those are getting explained. Well, when it comes to lending, when it comes to how you interact with people, how you interact with rulers, things of that nature. Because what you find is insight into how to live in the light of the grace that they've been given. You have insight into how to live in holiness with a God that is holy, and how to live in the light of who the Lord is and what the Lord has done. That's what we're finding here in all of this. And they're fleshing out what that would look like, and how you should interact. When we move into 23:10, the subject matter changes again, not from so much of a social justice and communal living. You get now into very specific issues around Sabbath and festival. What's interesting to me inside of, and this is a small portion, it's from 23:10 to 23:19. So it's not a great deal of verses that help explain this. Obviously, you have the formation of 3 major worship times in the Old Testament. So much of the Old Testament worship is tied to the festivals. And when we get into the New Testament, you notice how they would have to go back to certain areas to worship at certain times, like Passover, festival of weeks or booths, different times of the year, where there are 3 majors, and you would go, and it's a week-long worship. And we can get in the New Testament, we can flesh those out about what's going on. But you have these 3 areas, 3 large seasons of worship that were tied in the calendar year, and you have insight into what you do there. But also notice inside this section, it has to deal with people using God's name. Why is that here? Think back to in the 10 Commandments. Where is Commandment 3, or what is Commandment 3? And it's listed in the first 4 that have to do specifically with what? With God, not so much other people. And so in this section of elaborated laws or rules which have to deal with God and worship, again you see the sacredness and the holiness of His name. Because what's been revealed to them is His name, and that's we talked when we looked into the 10 Commandments, I think 2 weeks ago. There's intimacy that's implied, and also the name we actually have for God. We don't know what that is. What was revealed to them, we don't know. That's lost. What they did is, because the name was so holy, they came up with another name. That whenever they said the other name, they meant the name that was revealed, tetragrammaton. And that name is lost. So what we have is the name that was the nickname, or whatever, the other name, Yahweh. And so Yahweh was the name that stood for what God's name was. That was revealed. But it's intimate, it's holy. And so you have it listed here inside of how you are to directly live with God Himself, which involves worship, which involves Sabbath, which involves His name. And so, which I think is just really cool. I don't have a theological word for it. I think it's awesome that the name of God is mentioned inside the whole concept of when it comes to Sabbath and when it comes to worship, those things that we would easily attribute to these are things set aside for God, but now you also have God's name being a part of that. Now you got something at the very end, says the best of your first fruits of the ground you shall bring to the house of the Lord. You should not boil young goat in a mother's milk. So you got some stuff that has to deal with worship in general. But the key is that the things that come out of this section have to do with God Himself and those things that are set aside in worship type events, festivals, Sabbath, and also God's name. Any comments or questions there about this section?
We're really still in chapter 21. You didn't, let's see, where was it? It's chapter 22, I guess it's 29b. Where it says the firstborn of your sons you shall give to
Yeah.
Okay. But, and my question is, it just goes on to say with your oxen and your sheep, you do the same. So with the son, I guess you're just dedicating.
Yeah. Well, it's obvious. Circumcision will show up for all persons. What many believe is that this is the forerunner to what, you remember the Nazirite vow that Samson takes?
Yes.
Okay, it's to set aside the firstborn for service to God compared to the family business or whatnot. It's the idea that they are set aside for a period of time for God, and not in sacrificial terms, but that you give to God as gratefulness for childbearing, back for service to God.
But then the sheep and oxen, those were.
They would be sacrificed or given to the usage of the priests. No, but the idea is, there are other examples in the Old Testament, even when we leave the Torah, where that's practiced. You have Hannah and Samuel, and she gives him for what? I mean, he's not a priest, but he helps a priest, right? Eli, and what does he do? He's hanging around cleaning up the place. Well, he doesn't belong to Hannah; he belongs to God, and of course, then he becomes a prophet. But the role of the prophet's not the same as the role of the priest. I mean, because even when Eli has two sons, right? What are they? They're priests. Now they get in trouble for unholy fires, whatever that means. But they're not. Samuel's not the same. Samuel would be, Samuel just be around here, doing whatever. And so there's that type of understanding that they're set aside for the service of the use of God.
But does she actually take care of
Who?
him?
That we don't know. I mean, Samuel would be, if Samuel's the example, no, she doesn't. I mean, she gives him over to the temple, and some of them. I mean, like the priests, there were a number of priests. They didn't all serve at the same time. They were given kind of like the altar guild. You get a month or whatever it is at a time ushering. We don't have the same ushers that show up every Sunday, and you pick from 50. I mean, some of them serve on January and they don't serve again until August. Same concept here. But now we don't know what happens when they're off. I mean, how do they eat? We just don't know yet. So last part is the way this ends. Now keep in mind, this is the ending of the fourth ascent. Moses goes up, he gets the 10 Commandments, and then he comes down with the commandments on the two that are written, and then he has these extra laws that go along with it. And the last part of this whole section is covenant promised again and covenant reaffirmed. Now they do this all the time. It's not just a one-time deal. You have what shows up in 23:20 through 23:33, where you have the promise of what God is going to do. I'm going to send my angel before you. The angel is going to lead you. He's going to prepare the way. Pay attention to this, and be careful to obey, because this is all the things that's going to happen. And then you get in 24, the beginning of 24, Moses said, and you have the people who reaffirm that. So it ends with a covenant promised again, and then a covenant that is reaffirmed. And what are they reaffirming? They're affirming this: the style of life that is dictated by God. They are that all life is to be held within the setting of the spiritual religious devotion to the Word of God, and it directs every aspect of life, which is what we've seen here. Not just the Big Ten, but you've got what do you do? How do you live with this? How do you live with that? Keep on, and they are to be a distinctive people, and the way they're going to be distinctive is they're going to be obedience to this God who is distinct. All that, fourth ascent. Now next week, you got a long homework assignment for next week, 24 through 32. And it has to deal with worship. And some of it's going to be very distinct when it comes to what shows up in worship, like the different altars, how they're going to be used. And then you're going to get in the tabernacle, and then you're going to get the whole concept of priest and what. Pay attention to the priest, pay attention to the description that is given. That's important. And why not just the everyday Joe doing it to make whatever? The description of everything, all the different utensils and altars. I mean, there's great description given to that. And then there's great description on how a priest should consecrate himself, what clothing he should wear. Well, why? And so, I thought all that matters, you just kind of roll up here and, start with the call to worship and ready to go, right? Maybe, maybe not. So that's your homework right here, worship, fifth ascent. And just we'll have about 3 more weeks in Exodus, then we'll be finished. All right? It says 24:12 through 32:15. Okay? All right. May the Lord bless you. Go in peace.